Manchuria, 1932. Winter's breath sliced through the northern plains of China like knives. Snow lay thick across the earth, burying villages that had once thrived, but now stood as silent, frozen corpses under Japanese boots. The Imperial Japanese Army had invaded the region under the false pretense of security, but their true goal was far more insidious: conquest, control, and the perfection of death as science. Inside a heavily guarded military compound near Harbin, something monstrous was being born. Not a bomb, not a tank, but an idea. A concept so inhuman that even the Nazis would later recoil at its scale. This place was called Zhongma Fortress. Its architect? A man with round glasses, calm speech, and the soul of a devil. Dr. Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist, a soldier, and an ambitious sadist cloaked in science. Dr. Ishii had convinced the Imperial Japanese High Command that biological warfare would be Japan's edge, a plague to conquer empires. But to master death, he needed test subjects, human ones. He got them. Thousands. The justification of evil. China is a decaying corpse, Dr. Ishii had once said in a Tokyo lecture. And what better environment to test purification? To the Japanese military elite, Chinese civilians were expendable, not human in their eyes. Koreans, Mongolians, even captured Russians. They were all fodder for the new gods of science. Doctors were recruited, not just for their skills, but for their obedience. The few who objected were quickly replaced or silenced. To Ishii's disciples, this was not crime. It was progress. The fortress expanded. Laboratories hummed. Holding cells multiplied. And then came the prisoners. Men, women, even children. Blindfolded, shackled, terrified. Inside the lab, the walls of Zhongma were thick concrete, clean, white-tiled, sterile, like a hospital. But make no mistake, this was a slaughterhouse dressed as a clinic. Each room was a chamber of a different horror. In one, a man was strapped to a table while his stomach was opened and dissected alive, organs carefully observed as he screamed himself hoarse. No anesthesia. That would corrupt the data. In another, a woman infected with syphilis was forced to have sex with another infected man, under the observation of lab assistants taking notes. Days later, her body would be sliced open to examine the spread. An old Russian soldier was placed in a pressure chamber. The air inside removed slowly until his eyes burst from his skull. Notes were taken, charts drawn. What was the goal? To master death. To understand the limits of human survival. To build weapons that would erase cities silently. The American Connection, Seeds of Horror. Dr. Ishii had studied in the West. He had visited laboratories in the U.S., met researchers at Harvard. He admired how the Americans had developed chemical weapons in World War I. But he had one criticism. They held back. They let morality slow them down. Unit 731 would have no such constraints. With the full backing of the Japanese High Command, Ishii's program was renamed and expanded. Unit 731. Located in Pingfang, the new base would cover 6 square kilometers, include over 150 buildings, and house more than 3,000 staff. It had its own crematorium, its own train station, even its own disease-breeding farms, filled with rats, fleas, and viral cultures. And beneath it all, a network of dungeons where test subjects, known only as Maruta, logs, awaited unspeakable fates. The silence of the world China cried out, but the world did not listen. Western journalists dismissed the rumors as anti-Japanese propaganda. Even when whispers reached embassies, Nobody imagined the scale of what was happening behind those walls. Japan's war machine grew stronger. Unit 731's funding tripled. The first field tests began in rural Chinese villages. Airdropped bombs filled with cholera and plague-infected fleas were deployed on unwitting populations. Rivers were poisoned. Wells tainted. Entire towns died in agony, vomiting blood, skin blackened, eyes blind. Japanese officers stood nearby, notebooks in hand. They came at night, not with screams, but with silence. In the darkness beyond Pingfang's high walls, the icy wind howled like a mourning ghost. But inside the facility, death had a different voice. It hissed from leaking steam pipes. It clicked from syringe needles. It gurgled from throats slowly filling with blackened blood. The prisoners, Chinese, Mongolian, Korean, Soviet, all dragged in blindfolded, were assigned not names, but numbers. They were no longer people. They were called maruta, logs, like timber, to be cut open and burned. But Unit 731 wasn't just a place of torture. It was a laboratory of madness, disguised as science. One morning, a young Korean woman, maybe 20, was led into Building 8. Her hands trembled, her knees knocked. She knew what was coming. 3 doctors in white coats stood around her. They didn't speak. One held a clipboard. Another carried a scalpel. She was strapped down. No anesthesia. No mercy. Her belly was sliced open while she was wide awake. The doctors carefully examined her organs, touching, noting, sometimes removing. They watched her eyes. They wanted to know how long she'd remain conscious after her liver was removed. The answer? 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Then silence again. The body was dumped behind the compound, stripped of flesh for skeleton collection. Her bones were numbered. Her name was never recorded. But this was only one experiment. Vivisections were daily. Prisoners were opened up for lung removal, stomach acid testing, live liver extraction, limb transplants between bodies. No one left the table alive. In the freezing chambers, things were worse. Men were stripped and forced to stand outside in sub-zero temperatures with arms dipped in water until they froze solid. Then, Japanese surgeons struck the limbs with metal rods to hear the ice shatter inside human flesh. Sometimes they would thaw the limbs slowly with hot water, only to repeat the process. They weren't studying survival. They were exploring limits of agony. The rape rooms existed too. Pregnant women were not accidental. They were created, forcibly. Soldiers raped female prisoners to make them pregnant, so Unit 731 could study the transmission of syphilis and other venereal diseases to fetuses. Babies were born deformed, screaming, diseased. Some were dissected alive for organ studies. And all of this, all of it, was documented in files, charts, photos, and preserved body parts. A Soviet prisoner named Victor, a former Red Army soldier, tried to resist. He attacked a guard with a tray and escaped into the hallway, naked, bleeding, screaming. He reached the outer wall, almost made it. A bullet caught him behind the neck. He fell against the barbed wire. His body stayed there for 2 days, as a warning. Later, a Japanese officer laughed. He died like a rat. But we'll open him up anyway. They did. Outside, Japan broadcasted propaganda of honor, empire, loyalty. Inside Unit 731, children were locked in gas chambers to test chemical weapon effectiveness. Their tiny lungs filled with mustard gas or hydrogen cyanide. Sometimes they were told they were playing a game. The game ended in slow, choking silence. One Japanese nurse, under duress, kept a diary. The children clung to my apron when they were led away. They believed I was their mother. She hanged herself 5 months later. Meanwhile, Dr. Ishii watched it all with satisfaction. He wasn't mad. He believed this was his divine purpose. He once told his staff, "We are not killing. We are creating knowledge. Japan will rise on the bones of these savages." They believed him. They cheered him. Until one day they realized the war was ending. And with it, the secrets would surface. August 1945. The United States dropped 2 atomic bombs, one on Hiroshima, another on Nagasaki. The Empire of Japan, battered and broken, prepared to surrender. Inside the secretive corridors of Unit 731, chaos erupted. The order was simple: burn everything. Prisoners, records, tools, cadavers, rooms, erase it all. Doctors doused labs with gasoline. Prisoners, still alive, were bayoneted or burned alive. Freezers full of frostbitten limbs were smashed. Entire files detailing how plague bombs could wipe out cities, shredded or incinerated. And those who carried out the horrors, they vanished into the smoke. General Shiro Ishii, the monster who walked free. General Shiro Ishii, the man who built and ran Unit 731, faked his death. Using forged documents, he slipped out of Tokyo and went into hiding in the Japanese mountains. He didn't hide from shame. He hid from American justice. But what happened next was worse than any war crime. America's dirty deal, immunity for monsters. When U.S. General Douglas MacArthur learned about Unit 731, he didn't arrest anyone. Instead, he sent a secret message. "Bring me the data. The experiments, the biological weapons research." In return, the U.S. granted full immunity to the doctors, even Ishii. Why? Because the Americans saw value in the suffering. The data from Unit 731 could help develop biological weapons against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. "We don't care where it came from," one U.S. official said, "as long as it helps us win the next war." So they brought the monsters in. Shiro Ishii testified behind closed doors, never in public. He lived a peaceful life, died of throat cancer in 1959, and was buried in a quiet Tokyo graveyard, with honor. The other butchers, where they ended up. Colonel Masaji Kitano took over Unit 731 after Ishii. Later became head of a pharmaceutical company. Lieutenant General Ryoichi Naito worked in medical research, contributed to Japan's post-war health industry. Dozens of Unit 731 doctors became professors, CEOs, even health ministers in post-war Japan. Not one of them faced trial. Tokyo trials, the omission that haunts history. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, the Asian Nuremberg, sentenced many Japanese war leaders to death. But Unit 731 was never mentioned. The U.S. classified all documents related to the experiments, buried under national security. Their victims vanished, their stories erased, and their murderers celebrated. It wasn't until the 1980s that whistleblowers and survivors began to speak. Even then, Japan's government never formally acknowledged Unit 731. No apology, no monument, no justice. Voices from the ashes, the survivors who remembered one survivor, a Chinese boy who escaped the complex, said, "I still see their faces. Not the doctors, the patients, the woman with no eyelids, the boy whose intestines were outside his body, still alive." I asked, "Why?" And the doctor said, "Because we could." A former Unit 731 soldier, in a rare interview, admitted, We weren't taught to see them as people. They were logs. Just logs in a fire that kept the empire burning. Legacy, the forgotten hell. We chose to ignore. Even today, textbooks in Japan omit Unit 731. No memorial stands where the complex once was in Harbin, China. Just a shadowy museum visited by the few who dare remember. And in the West, the story remains buried under layers of Cold War secrecy. But the silence doesn't mean innocence. It means complicity. The screams may have stopped in 1945, but their echoes never did.